What's up, everybody, and welcome to Real Time for the Real Everyday Movie Fan. I'm Ryan Murphy,
And I'm James Sheridan.
and today we are giving you our real time review of Borg. This is the fourth episode of our
Mhm.
journey through the Borg Collective. And as James just told me off camera, we're running out of the good ones. So uh, we just got done with the epic Best of Both Worlds, which is sort of the Borg episode of Next
Yeah.
Generation. And they beat the Borg once and they never knew what to do with them, so they never really brought them back except for a couple of episodes with Hugh. And it's not really about being against the Borg, it's more I don't
And
it
that was sort of the impetus of this episode is that they didn't know what to do with the Borg. They of course wanted to bring them back as they were supposed to be the big bad of this
Mhm.
series, but how do you keep bringing back an undefeatable enemy that you just happen to beat each time? It's like how do you do an episode about the Borg without having to fall into that same trap of like we write ourselves into a corner and how do we get out of it? Um, and they decided instead of it being about the Borg entirely, you make it small, intimate, and about an individual Borg and deal with the sort of residual consequences of everything that happened. I talked about in Best of Both Worlds Part Two, how like something I wanted to see more of was, Picard kind of dealing with the trauma of things. And this is basically the episode that does that within the scope of like the TV aspect of there's a bit in Picard, but it's kind of like after the fact, an afterthought, whereas this is like dealing face first with the consequences of like how
Mhm.
does a man who's been traumatized by this deal with being face to face with his enemy kind of thing. And the
Yeah.
crew at large really having to deal with being face to face. Guinan as well, having to deal with like being face to face with an individual Borg as opposed to the entire sort of faceless collective and deal with, you know, their emotions about this and deal with like their own sort of prejudice about this and whatnot and treating an individual as opposed to an enemy kind of thing. um this is probably my favorite episode of the series because it goes into a lot of what I feel Trek does best, and that's sort of like explorations about humanity and questions about morality. And like at one point they're literally planning how to create a Borg genocide by using this person as a suicide bomber within his own collective to try and destroy the entire collective. And whether you land on one side of that argument or the other, it doesn't really matter within the scope of this episode. It's just about them facing the reality of what that means and facing the person that they're going to have to send into battle that way. They end up kind of doing it anyway, accidentally, by sending him back with this sort of like sense of individuality and then corrupting a whole bunch of other Borg with a sense of individuality. It wasn't what they intended, but it ends up resulting in sort of the same thing regardless. Um, and I love when Star Trek does that, when it focuses on the human perspective on um, complex things like emotions, trauma, morality. Um, Everyone is dead set that we're in the midst of war with these people. They aren't even really people. And when you're confronted with an individual, do you still have that same conviction to kind of destroy his people, basically create genocide? And that's to me that again, this is what Trek does best is when it focuses on those things. We keep talking about Measure of a Man, where it's this beautiful sort of concept about what is sentience, what makes a being sentient as opposed to a machine. And Star Trek, I think has always been a great sort of avenue to explore those concepts in a sort of, I don't want to say like microcosmic kind of scale where it's like it's removed from our reality, but the analog sort of like comparison is evident enough that you can see what they're talking about. One of the very famous episodes in original Trek was these black and white faced creatures
Yeah.
who
Hmm.
one side of the species had black and white on one side and the other, and then the other side of the species was flipped, and they had this like bizarre prejudice against each other when it's like you're basically the same people. You just
Hmm.
can't see it because it's this like absurd sort of like um racial divide between them that is really just skin deep, and it's a little heavy handed, but it was the '60s, and they like still trying to figure out how to do the social commentary thing, and I think um it's one of the more obvious episodes about that they're trying to do a social commentary. And I don't think they're doing social commentary here necessarily, but I do like that they push the characters to kind of confront these ideas, um, and leave it to the audience to kind of like decide where they land on these issues. Um, and of course, there are aspects of this also that kind of change our perspective on the Borg, like we discussed in Best of Both Worlds. The concept of assimilation seemed to be a new concept as of the second episode. So
Mhm.
in a 4-part series, like I always think of like the Borg episodes as like 4 episodes within TNG, because growing up I had that VHS box set and it always had the 4 episodes: QU, Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2, and I Borg. And this is the one that kind of like introduces the idea that assimilation is just a common concept for them. It just hadn't occurred to anybody prior to Picard having been assimilated. And it's just something, it's just their MO, and it's just something that they assume to do. But even within that, the later sort of narrative is that all the Borgs have the ability to inject nanites into people and to start assimilation on an individual basis, and they become more of like a zombie type species where like basically if you're bit you turn kind of thing.
Yep.
Whereas like there's none of that within these 4 sort of canon episodes of TNG. Even when they take Picard, they basically scan him, take him, and then assimilate him on the ship. We see the process of assimilation on the ship and not them injecting the nanites. And at no point is anybody like fearful that Hugh is going to do that to them. Whereas like later on, you don't even want to go near anyone because they
Mhm.
might be, if you're in arm's reach, they can basically infect you. And it's like it's interesting watching these episodes with the lens of having seen the entirety of the Borg sort of storyline and what we've come to understand as the Borg. And it's not really present in the sort of 4 canon episodes. It's like a slow sort of burn to get to that point. And even then,
Mhm.
it's like a lot of the aspects that we've come to know as the Borg, like the Queen, like the spherical ships, and like all the stuff came with, First Contact and Voyager and all that stuff, is not present in like what I consider to be like the canon Borg story. And it's like it's fascinating to watch this journey on an individual episode basis and break it down, seeing that evolution, how things changed over time. Um, so as you can tell, I love this episode. I've thought about this episode a lot over the years because um, it means a lot to me, and it's a very Hugh is one of my favorite characters because of the journey he kind of goes on in this episode, and how he kind of challenges everybody. Um, and it just, I don't know, I think it's a great episode. It's not on the same caliber as Best of Both Worlds. Best of Both Worlds is just a powerhouse of episodes, um, that we like
Where you say this is your
as we
favorite episode of the series?
yeah. I'm giving credit where credit's due in terms of like those are better episodes in terms of like what they mean for canon, what they mean for Trek as a whole, because it was the big turning point that kind of launched TNG into a new stratosphere of like we are not living in the shadow of TOS anymore. We are our own
Mhm.
thing. We have our own very effective methods of storytelling, and this was sort of like the proving ground for that. Whereas Iborg is just a very small personal episode, and because it's personal, it means a lot to me, and um, it's always been one of my favorites. So that's my 2 cents.
Oh, there you go. I that says a lot about it. The other note I have is just, we talk about, retconnings that the Borg have always assimilated. You would go went into that. Um, talked about the point of, this episode came about because they didn't know what to do with the Borg now. The one thing I have is, it's not really part of the review, but there's a part where Picard's in his ready room and he's like on his little computer, and the Q will come in and he like kind of is very dismissive, like, I'm in a bad mood, leave me alone. And all
Mm-hmm.
he's doing is looking at a picture of the
I
Enterprise.
saw that too, and I'm like, why? Like he just goes in there, he turns on the computer, and it's just cycling shot of the Enterprise, and I'm like, do you not
It's
have
so
more
pretty.
important things to be doing right now? But he's
He's
so
just trying to look
dismissive.
busy.
It's the weirdest shot. It's like I have a feeling like they had him just turn it on and they had to comp something in there and they had no idea what to put in there. So they just put in like any generic shot that they had, kind of ready off the shelf kind of thing, and it's like it's the strangest little visual to have on the computer when you're right, he's kind of like stormed off in this tantrum, and it's like you're the ship's captain. Do you have not anything better to do than go over the blueprints of the ship? Like that's
Well,
not
you
your
also
department. So
yeah, you also talk about credit where credit due, credit where credit is due. This episode was written by Renee Echevarria, who's some of his other credits. I mean, he's did a lot for TNG. Um, he wrote the first episode he wrote was The Offspring, which was also the first episode that Jonathan Frakes directed. And That's another great episode. Stuff like Ship in a Bottle. Um, not, yeah, there's some other stuff I'm not really recognizing, but Deep Space Nine went on to Deep Space Nine after the end of Next Generation, and yeah, so credit to him because like all these episodes so far have been written by
killer.
single people.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Q Who was written by Maurice Hurley. Best of Both
Yes.
Worlds was written by Michael Piller, and this was written by Renee Echevarria. So,
And
yeah,
it should be noted that this was also directed by the series editor, whose name it escapes me at the moment, which I thought was fascinating because editors don't tend to get that kind of opportunity to direct. So
it's
I
directed
thought he did a
by
fantastic job too.
Robert Lederman.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
And so the Borg still have those weird abs that we talked about in
But
Best
they're
of Both
starting to get more like
Worlds.
more components to them and more like it's starting
Yeah,
to look like armor as opposed to just like a jumpsuit with, you know,
abs.
tubing on it. And you love the abs for some reason. You're focused on the abs.
It's just no, it's just such a weird aesthetic to say. I mean, people made such a big deal about bat nipples, you know, and it's like this feels almost like as weird an aesthetic decision as bat nipples. Because why did the Borg just put abs on their suit? Especially when in Best of Both Worlds, when it's just Picard, that's all he has. It's just a black
Yeah.
jumpsuit with some abs on it. I just it's bizarre to me, but that's okay. Honestly, you summed it up pretty well. This is a little, the one other note I had was no one's mentioning the fact that Picard was once a Borg and was de-assimilated. You talk about this in some of our earlier reviews of the idea that you can be de-assimilated. Like why is Picard so dead set on not believing this is capable of being a person when
Mhm.
that's exactly what happened to him? But at the same time, I feel like it's a little bit strange. Like, well, we're going to now that he's been made an individual, we're going to reintroduce him into the collective and see if that changes the collective. And of course, that does.
Well, that wasn't
As
really their intent because they knew that if he went back, he would be sort of reassimilated and his memory
yeah,
wiped. They bring that up in the
hmm
dialogue that, whether they do it or the Borg do it, it's going to end up being the same thing. But what I love is that they don't make that choice; they give that choice to Hugh, which is so important to the development of the story, where they've given him back his individuality. Um, like there is a juxtaposition with Lokitos and Picard is able to just go back to being Picard fully. Hugh doesn't remember Hugh who he was before this, so he's sort of
hmm
developing a new sort of sense of humanity. Um, but it's so important if they've given him this individuality and they honor individuality so much, he should have a choice in what his fate is, and he chooses rather beautifully because of his kind of like budding friendship with Geordi. I'd almost call it a love for Geordi.
hmm
He wants to protect Geordi and care for Geordi. And he knows that if he stays, the Borg are going to come after him. He knows if he goes back, he's basically going to be sacrificing himself. And he makes that choice himself. And I love that for both Hugh's development, because as we end up finding out, it actually works in the opposite direction, where his individuality kind of infects this sort of, at least his ship of collective. I'm never really clear on how far his reach goes because we only ever see like a small sort of collection of them. But um, it being his choice just means so much to me, and I think it means so much to him as well. Um, there's also a few sort of we talk about the development of the Borg as like each episode kind of brings new aspects. This is the first time that we hear the concept of the Borg sort of naming convention, Hugh being 3 of 5, And of course,
Mhm.
later on, famously, 7 of 9 on Voyager. This is the first time we've understood what a designation means to them. Um, it's also fun little anecdote. Famously, later in this episode, Hugh refers to himself as I, whereas like they established very early in this episode that they constantly refer to themselves as we, which is a hilarious contrast to Locutus being the only individual Borg that we ever really meet, and he only refers to himself as I. He never refers to himself as we. It's only I am Locutus. Um, but this episode just pretends that we understand that them being a collective, it's always been we. There's no sense of individuality. There's no sense of I, except that very early in the script they fucked up and left in
Yeah.
him saying, "Do I have a name?"
Yeah, it's so
And
weird
they
that no one
didn't.
caught that in
No
production or
one.
anything.
Well, they did catch it, but they caught it very late in the script process when they'd already shot that scene. And
Mhm.
Michael Piller went in and was like, "Can we change that because that's it kind of like destroys our credibility later on when he does say I." And it's the shocking moment to um Picard, but like they pretend the entire time that we is just a common thing when that's never been introduced until this episode. And I like even the episode being named I Borg, which of course is a play off of I Robot and I Claudius, famously. But like the idea of the individuality being so different and so contrasting, and the concept of him referring to himself in the first person as opposed to as a collective. Interesting that they just introduced it in this episode, but we're supposed to pretend it's always existed, and then they just kind of like screw it up in the script process of like forgetting that one sort of like they didn't check that beforehand and left in that one little snag at the beginning. It doesn't ruin the episode at all. It doesn't betray that moment for me whatsoever. It's just sort of a fun little anecdote that I thought was kind of
You can play
interesting.
with
And
it with your own head canon. You can be like, that was really the beginning for him, and
yeah,
they
he's
just went
already
past
breaking and
everyone in the
seeing
room,
himself as an individual. I
and no
kind of
one
like that
noticed it at the
idea.
time. Yeah,
Yeah. And you could extend
went
that
over
further
there.
to like it's not shocking for Hugh to have said I, it's shocking for Picard to hear a Borg say
Mhm.
I, as opposed to himself, who'd always referred to himself in the first person. But that's a different sort of avenue to go down. But again, I could go on and on about how great this episode is, um, especially with Picard and Guinan being two of the most sort of traumatized individuals within the crew, and both of them facing this individual, and kind of having to look him in the face and like kind of face their own prejudice. And I kind of love seeing them kind of
Mhm.
turn on that to the point where Guinan even has to go to Picard and talk him into going to see
Yeah.
Hugh, in a very weird scene where I don't understand why they did it this way, where they have Hugh kind of trapped in the containment field in the lab, but then they teleport him to be alone with Picard in Picard's ready room. And I'm like, why doesn't Picard just go to where he's safely sort of secured? And like he
No
teleports
bodyguards
in
or
with
anything.
Worf,
Just
but then he kicks Worf out of the room. And it's like, I don't quite understand the logic of this scene, but you do you, I guess. But yeah, I can go on and on about just how much I love this episode. I think it's fairly clear that it's one I care about a lot because I haven't shut up since we started recording. But it like there's so many reasons why this is my favorite, and that was I shit on Picard as a series a lot. That was one of my favorite things about season one was the fact that they brought Hugh back as a person, and he was so integral to what they were doing with that sort of cube dismantling, and not just that, but introducing Borg into like giving them their humanity again, and he's continuing his sort of journey on that path,
and
and
they kill
and and then they kill him, and it's like, why did you no why did
him.
you do that? I was liking your series and then you did that, and it's like, oh, now I can't forgive you for a lot of things you're doing because I was willing to overlook a lot of this, but then you kill one of the best side characters you've ever created. Fun fact: he actually the actor Jonathan Del Arco, who played Hugh, actually tried out for Wesley. He was in the
Mhm.
running to play Wesley early on, but when they gave it to Will Wheaton, he swore to never watch Next Generation. He'd been a huge Star Trek fan, grew up on the original series, but When he didn't get the part, he was so bitter he didn't want to watch the show. But then he got the part, and one of his buddies said to him, "Dude, you're going to be famous now. Not because people are going to like recognize you as like a big important character, but like you're not going to be sort of like someone on the like convention circuit, but like this character is going to mean something to people." And he even called it like one of the best scripts he'd ever read. So it's fun anecdotes.
Well, it's a good episode. I don't know what else to say. Yeah, it's an episode about humanity and overcoming prejudice and everyone, yeah. Um, anything else?
I mean, don't open that door for me because I could go on. Like, I've got all kinds of notes here that I made watching the episode that like I could just go on and on about the little things that they were doing to kind of, underline this sort of theme for the episode. But like I've gone on and on about it. It's like I think I've covered the broad
I
strokes of
see.
it. But
But this is very lopsided because I don't like. Yeah, I have like. Well, Picard was looking at a picture of the Enterprise, and and James is like all this existential themes and everything, and I'm like, but look at the little picture of the Enterprise.
but that again, I think that's what Trek does best is those themes, is that sort of look into humanity.
Oh,
And
I agree.
this
I
is
agree,
this
and
is
I
one of
agree
those
with everything
episodes that
that
does it
you just said
very
it so
well.
well.
And
Yeah, I don't.
um,
This. Yeah.
that's why it's my favorite. I love Hugh. I love them kind of because like again, the Borg was one of my favorite sort of through line stories in TNG, and um, obviously through the movies as well. Less so in Voyager, and the Enterprise episode was kind of fun, but um, like to me, this is the end of the canon of the Borg. Everything else that comes after is sort of whatever. Well, except for First Contact, but like this episode just is so good, so beautiful, so well done. Does what Trek does best, and um, I love Hugh. I love the story. Geordi was always one of my favorite crew members, and seeing him kind of connect with this Borg and whatnot, and just I'm babbling now. It's just such a good episode. I fully encourage, if you haven't seen it, please go and see it because it's just, even if you don't know anything about the Borg, I think they give you enough context to kind of understand Borg bad, people traumatized, facing your enemy kind of thing. And it's just such a good sort of interesting episode. Yeah, it's definitely in like I wouldn't expect it to be in anyone else's top five, but it's my number one.
There you go. I think James said it best. I don't even know how to add to that. So we're gonna come back with Descent next week. Descent Part 1, and then yeah,
Even though it's
that
Hugh,
might be
it's just like
that might be a really brief episode. So until then, I'm Ryan Murphy,
and I'm Shane Sheridan
and thank you for keeping it real.
with ReelTime. Good night.
Good night.